start recording. Okay, hopefully that's working. All right, so this is our session disclaimer from the Foundation. All opinions expressed by the Getulio Vargas Foundation employees and guests in online events and broadcasts exclusively represent their own opinions and not necessarily the Foundation's institutional position. We also reiterate that everyone present here agreed to participate in this event of their own free will, and they consented to be recording in this broadcast, which will be posted later on FGV's official channels. So hopefully that's okay with everyone. If not, you maybe have your camera off. And let's go ahead and get started with our first presenter, Marisa Bucheli. Oh, we can't, you have to unmute yourself. Should I unmute you or?
Okay, no. Excuse me. Well, I'm going to present this paper. The title is Short and Medium-Term Effects of Parental Separation on Children's Well-Being, Evidence from Uruguay. We did this study with Andrea Vigorito. We are both from Universidad, República in Uruguay. So, okay. So there is evidence for developed countries that there are effects of parental union dissolution on a child academic and social-emotional outcomes of children. And one of the channels that may explain this worsen of outcomes is economic instability that is provoked by divorce or separation. And for developed countries, they find that even in presence of public transfer systems or child support payments, this income loss is not compensated. So when we go to evidence for developing countries, and particularly for Latin America, there are a few studies only. And qualitatively, the results are similar. There are income losses that are not compensated by child support nor public transfers. But in fact, the problems are worsened because income losses are higher and public transfers systems are weak, and fulfillment with child support by fathers is very, very weak too. So what we want with this study is to provide evidence of short and medium run effects. Now I'm going to say what this is. Of divorce or separation, we're going to use divorce or separation for talking about the two phenomena. So we want to provide evidence of the effects on educational outcomes, time devoted to study and leisure activities, social emotional well-being, and labor force participation of children. Then we want to see if there are different effects by different parent involvement and for boys and girls. And we also want to study economic moderators. That is, what are the effects of unions dissolution on economic household income and mothers' outcomes. Well, we have good data. We have panel data, which is one of the weaknesses of Latin American studies. Our cohort study follows first graders attending public school in urban areas in 2004. We work with 3 waves. The first one, wave 1, is carried out, as I said, in 2004. Children are age 6. And the other waves that are 3 and 4, children are aged 12 and 19. So we use a subsample of these children, 810 children, that they are children whose parents were married or cohabited in the first wave, and in the following waves, both father and mother were alive. And there are 2 possible situations: children with both father and mother, or they only live with their mother. And this is how we identify that a separation divorce took place. Around 13% of children suffer, and I would say there are divorce in around 13% of cases between waves 1 and 3, and 21% of cases between wave 1 and 4. As you see, we do not study children who live with their father and not with their mother. Well, we do a definitive fixed effect estimation. Our variable of interest, our coefficient of interest is beta, where D is a binary variable that reflects divorce or separation. Our main estimations are two. In one, we use wave 1 and 3, and the other one, we use wave 1 and 4. And we have alternative specifications. First, very important, we have we check for the effects of divorce timing. For that, we interact our D variable with a dummy variable that captures if divorce took place during childhood or in the adolescence of the child. We also use an interactive variable multiplying the variable D by gender to assess differences between boys and girls. And then we have two other estimations to study father's involvement. In one, we interact the dummy variable with the presence of child support payment. And in the other one, we interact the separation variable with the presence of contact between fathers and children. For all the estimations, we do the AETO test to assess how omitted variables and selectivity might affect our results. And we also do a placebo test that I'm not going to present in this presentation. It is in the appendix of the paper. So I go through the results. Well, as I said, one of our outcomes of interest are related to education. The three variables are school attendance, grade repetition, two binary variables, and years of schooling. And in the first row, we have the estimation when we use 12, 1, and 3. In bold, we have the results when they were statistically significant and robust to the AET test. So as we can see, we see an increase of the likelihood of repeating in childhood, but it is not robust. What it is robust is that there is a decline of the years of schooling. Then when we see waves 1 and 4, we also see a similar effect. In this case, there is a negative effect on school attendance, but what it is robust is a loss of 1 year approximately of years of schooling. And in the timing interactive variables, which are the last two rows, we see that the short effect of years of schooling that we saw in childhood, in school, now we see that we have almost 1 year of loss of income, loss of years of schooling. I'm going to use this, I'm talking about this they So children whose parents divorced in childhood, who had this adverse effect in school, at age 19, they have this negative effect. We also find, as I said, these two effects that are not robust. And we also find that when separation takes place in adolescence, there are short run time effects. As you see, they are not different from this effect that we find for the other children. Well, now I'm going to talk about heterogeneity. When we do the estimations by gender, or looking at differences by gender, we find that boys, the adverse effects are replicated for boys. They are more likely to repeat and have less years of schooling related to union dissolution. And they lost 1.3 years of schooling when they are at age 19. In the case of girls, we find the same results in childhood, but at age 19, the effects are not so large for girls. Particularly, we do not find effects on school attendance, and the loss of years is 0.6 instead of 1.3. But there's explanations, perhaps related with the effect of of absence of fathers when gender roles have a role to play. Well, use of time, you can only study this with waves 1 and 3. We find a reduction of time devoted to study, though not robust, but it is consistent with the worsening of educational outcomes. A robust effect of reduction of playing sports. This is related to boys. In the case of girls, we do not find these effects, but we find an increase of time spent in front of a computer. And we do not find effects on reading and watching TV for boys and girls. No one of them. As I said, we also study the child socioeconomic well-being, socio-emotional well-being, and we do not find effects except a positive slight effect in the conduct problem subscale, which is not expected in any case. We don't know, perhaps it's mother's perception, or perhaps divorce soften family tensions. And we do not find effects on child's labor for participation, working hours, etc. What about father's involvement? What it was, in fact, one of our, we wanted to look at this, but in fact, we found in childhood no robust results, and only the only effect that perhaps there is a partial reverse of the bad effect, the negative effect on youth schooling is at age 19, but it is weak in any case. Well, in fact, this makes us to put our focus on what happened with economic hardship. Perhaps the deterioration of educational outcomes is related to this. So I am going to present a table. So these 3 columns are related to the effect of union dissolution on well-being of the household where the children live. So we see at age 12, a loss of 39.1% of per capita household income, an increase of the likelihood of being poor, and a decrease of our durable good index that we estimate. So it is an important loss, income loss. And here we have some variables that help to this number not to be so deep, but it is 39% of loss. So there is, although there is this loss, in fact, public transfer play a very important role. And as you see here, the response of the mother, who increased the labor for participation, the working hours, and her earnings. But none of that can compensate this loss. Well, here we have wave 1 and 4. But let's see here the medium run effect. So look at, we said that children had a loss of 39% of income loss at age 12. The income loss at age 19 is 33%. So the effect lasts. And well, as you can see, the interactive with adolescence also indicates an income loss. So what we do not have here is a lasting effect of the reaction of mothers. Well, in fact, I think I'm on time. So what I have here is a brief survey of what I said. We have short effects of union dissolution and a medium run effect. That what it is robust is that we can say that there is almost 1 year of schooling of loss, and it is not robust, but there is a decline of school attendance. The impact is larger for boys and girls. We also see a decline of time spent in studying and playing sport in the case of boys. We do not find impact on the CDQ, except a weak positive effect in the contact problems subscale. We find an increase of an economic hardship for custodian mothers. And we interpret that they might mediate those worsen of child outcomes. There is an important role of public transfers, but they do not compensate the income losses. And in the case of our father's involvement, well, we do not find robustness results. So we think that perhaps we could deepen in this study because, well, there are new child support payment regulations today. There are some changes in the regulations in Uruguay, and well, we would like to see something more about this, and the data also allows us to study something about maternal power before and after divorce. Well, that's all. Thank you. I think that I'm on time. I didn't check my watch, but I think I am on time. Thank you.
Yes, great. Thank you so much. We have 2 or 3 minutes. Does anyone have any questions before we move on? Oh, okay, Laura?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you so much for the very interesting presentation. I was wondering if you have information on whether the mother remarried or not, because especially in terms of the role model for boys and also for the economic hardship, I thought that this could also play a role.
Yes, we have information about remarriage. And I remember that we tried to do something, but I don't remember exactly now. I don't know if Andrea, if you want to say something, because
yes, we tried to check whether remarriage had a role, and we didn't find an impact in this paper. Although in a previous one we found an impact on outweighing the income loss.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, I guess if anyone thinks of anything at the end, since we have extra time. Okay, so next we have Selma.
Should I also start, because so it was written that we were discussing. I mean, I was discussant for
Oh,
the
okay.
paper.
I think the discussion is supposed to be after.
It's at the end. Okay.
Yeah, because it says it's supposed to be at 2:20, so I guess we'll do it at 2 since there's only 3 of us. Hopefully.
Okay. Okay.
I thought we
okay?
had 15 minutes talk and 5 minutes
Oh,
discussion.
okay. So I'm so
and
sorry.
added 20.
That's my
Probably
fault.
makes sense that way. Yeah.
Yes, it does. Okay, so yes, we'll have the discuss it now. Yeah, great.
Okay. So I have some slides to share. Here. Okay. Can you see my screen? Yeah. So I won't go through the summary because you summarized at the end very well. So first of all, thank you very much for your presentation. It was a very good paper and I really liked and enjoyed reading it on the first place. I just have a few comments. It's mainly a clarification question because again, it was a very good paper and very well written. So just for the setting of the difference in difference, it was a bit unclear to me at the beginning because you explained the fixed effect model, and finally, after your presentation, I understand now that it's because you don't add all waves of your survey, so you only have 2 periods. But maybe a little bit more of explanation in the paper could have helped at least me to understand. And also, I understood that you have another paper where you use the matching method, and I was wondering why here you didn't use matching as well as a difference in difference. Yeah, also I was a bit confused with the descriptive statistics. I didn't find, for instance, the number of boys and girls in the panel. So maybe it's just me and I missed the information, but I couldn't find it in the tables. And as you have heterogeneous effect, I thought it could be interesting to have this information. Yes, I was also wondering if you have multiple children by households, and if we could find an heterogeneous effect. For instance, if firstborn could have been more affected because they take care of the younger siblings, or the reverse. I don't know if you had just one child by household, or multiple, and if this question could be an interesting one to look at. Also about panel attrition. So you said that you have 44% of panel attrition, and it's just a clarification question. I was wondering how households are tracked through the waves, and if it's by location, because I guess there could be more after separation, both parents could move away, and then we have another representation of couples separating that are not in the panel anymore. Although I guess there's another way to track the household, but just to clarify. And finally, so I think you said at the beginning that you don't study household where the fathers take care of the children, and I know that in most, I'm not sure, but I would say that in most countries, I think a vast majority of parents divorcing, it's the mother that takes care of the children. But could you have this information of fathers being the primary caregiver after separation, and the possibility to look at differential effects, if there is any, if it's possible. And finally, I think you mentioned in the literature review in the paper a few heterogeneity, for instance, the fact that authoritative parents divorce less, the fact that mothers tend to work more, etc. And could this be also, could you look at heterogeneous effects by those variables? So for instance, I just an idea, but parents that have, I have to say that, sorry, that have an authoritative parenting style, their children are less affected by or more affected by the separation, something like this. So yes, that was my only comments. Again, thank you very much for your presentation. I really liked the paper, and it's very interesting. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Margaux. We gave us interesting feedback, because there are more things that we can do. Just one thing to explain, because one is that the matching procedure, we did it, but it was similar to the results did not change. So we presented this one, and we only included this in the paper, but perhaps we should say that we did it.
Okay.
Well, just the questions, because I think particularly, I think it is very interesting to try to see a heterogeneous effect as the things you said, because the literature, particularly with this type of thing of raising parents, etc., the practices, and well, we have to think of how it can be done. But okay, I think it's interesting. Another thing is that we dropped to the cases where children are with the father and not with the mother, but there are very few children. So in the Uruguayan case, it is not a practice. I think that European data allow to study another type of arrangements, but not in our case. I think that the problem of potential bias, because of it was more difficult, because there is a previous work that shows that we have not lost, the attrition is not dependent on some variables, on a lot of variables, but I don't know if we have something about more losses of children whose parents are divorced. I'm not sure about that.
Okay.
But thank you. I don't know, Andrea, if you want to say anything else.
No, thank you for the comments.
Okay, yes, in the interest of time, so that we can have people, if they wanted to join the individual talks, let's go ahead and move on now to Selma Walter. And if we want to discuss more, I think we can do that at the very end. But for now, let's move on. Great, thank you.
Okay, Can you hear me and see my screen? Perfect. Okay, thanks very much for the opportunity. So I'm going to talk to you today about this paper, which is joint work with Andreas Kotsadam and Bernt Bratsberg, who are both at the University of Oslo. And in this paper, we're interested in shedding some light on what's going on with male fertility. So as opposed to female fertility, about which we know quite a lot, we sort of want to now take a look at what we can see in terms of who's having children, the distribution, and if we can say anything about the determinants of what we see. One of the things I'm going to talk about is that we're going to see a bit of inequality in men's family outcomes. So we're going to look at fertility and related outcomes. And there is an existing literature suggesting, a few papers suggesting that there may be a section of the male population left behind in terms of some other outcomes, such as income, incarceration, health outcomes, suicide rates. And this has been mostly documented in the US. And we're going to tap into that literature a little bit and show that there's also some men being left behind in terms of family outcomes and maybe some evidence for what might be driving this. So I'm sure in this session, you're all well aware of the dramatic changes in societal, family, and work patterns that we've seen over the last few decades. So this is not news to you. But we want to sort of set the backdrop for what we find in this paper, and some of the important things that have changed over the last few decades are the growth in out-of-wedlock births and the growing number of single mums, so the sort of absent fathers, and also the changing life cycle pattern of women. We know that women's economic independence and relative wage has increased. And there's been a sort of widening gap between the returns to unskilled and skilled labor. So again, tapping into that notion of left behind men, the stagnating returns to unskilled labor are potentially going to be quite important. So our contribution is that we're going to provide the first serious look at the distribution of male fertility and its economic drivers. One of the reasons we can do this is because we have access to Norwegian registry data. So this is administrative data, and that includes the children of all women and all men in the population. So this is really crucial because other types of data that we might use, such as census data or survey data, usually only provide information on children via their connection to their mother. So if a household would be separated, then we would know about the children residing in the household and their connection to the mother. But if the father is absent from that household, we would not be able to connect him to his children in the data, if that makes sense. Well, here we have birth certificate data. So even with broken families, we can connect the father to the child. So that's where we can actually say something that's the sort of reliable. Okay, so in the interest of time, I won't be discussing too much about the literature, and I'll just touch briefly on the data and then show you some graphs and some findings. So you might ask yourself whether Norway is special. We were talking before the session started how there's a sort of disproportionate amount of work on these countries precisely because the availability of data is so good. But then we have to ask ourselves to what extent we have external validity from this data. So one of the key things about Norway is that, well, they're quite an egalitarian society, and so it's very typical to have a two-earner household. And there's a very strong social security net, even in the case of poor labor market outcomes, such as unemployment. And also we know that cohabitation is very common and marriage is very uncommon, actually. So marriage as a sort of formal piece of paper has been declining rapidly. And when we look at marriage in the data, we're going to combine cohabiting and married households. Okay, so let me show you a few graphs, and I'll focus your attention on just a couple of the panels within this figure. So the first thing we're looking at is we're going to be looking at the proportion of men who are childless at age 40 in the Norwegian population. And in this graph, we're going to be showing you 3 representative cohorts. Okay, they're labeled here. So men born between 51 and 53, 64 and 66, and 77 and 79, sort of 3 like random cohorts, if you like. And what we're plotting this against on the x-axis is the earnings rank within your cohort. Okay, so we take your average earnings between ages 20 and 40, and then we check where that sits within your own cohort. So it's a within cohort lifetime earnings rank. Okay, and what we see is that childlessness rates are highest for the lowest earning men in Norway, and then obviously lowest for the highest earners. But what's quite remarkable is if you actually look at the numbers, the difference between the lowest earners, where you're getting close to 70% childlessness, as compared to the highest earners, where you have maybe 10% childlessness. So we really see childlessness focused among these lowest earners here, let's say in the bottom 20% of the population. And then the parallel graph showing total number of children, so total fertility by age 40, then obviously showing the opposite pattern. So the highest earners have the most children and the lowest earners have the fewest children. And another way that we can show this information is, instead of looking at 3 random cohorts, we can instead take all the cohorts on the x-axis and take 3 points of the distribution. So we take the bottom 10% of earners, the middle 10% of earners, and the top 10% of earners. And then we look at what's happening over time across different cohorts. And so what we see is that there's a widening inequality between the lowest and highest earners. So while in the earliest cohort here, let's say 1951 cohort, we have a gap of perhaps 30% childlessness, this gap widens to more like 50% in the most recent cohorts. So there's a sort of widening inequality in childlessness between the lowest and highest earners over time. And we see that same widening inequality with total fertility. Okay, so these are sort of crucial facts that kind of inspire the rest of the paper. So firstly, seeing that earnings are extremely important for fertility, and secondly, seeing this change over time. So seeing that the lowest earners are sort of being left behind and are not having this access to family life. Okay, so what might be some of the drivers of this inequality? Well, being economists, we're going to argue that there are economic factors by the marriage market that are going to drive this inequality. And as I alluded to at the beginning, we know that there's been a reduction in the returns to unskilled labor relative to skilled labor. And also we know there's low partnering or high divorces. So we're really going to focus on this economic channel of earnings and try to show that in a more causal way. But you may have in the back of your mind that there can be other things correlated with earnings rank that I could just as well put on the x-axis that might correlate with fertility in the same way. So these might be health or biological factors, incarceration, so going to prison, or indeed even data quality, missing dads from birth certificates. So we showed actually in a few sort of descriptive charts that these alternative factors are not large enough to explain the variation we see in childlessness. So if we first show relative earnings, it's important to document that even in Norway, a country that's very egalitarian and with a strong social safety net, we still see a big increase in inequality between the lowest earners, which are down here, and the highest earners in the population. So basically the lowest earners in real terms have essentially flat earnings over the last 30 cohort years, while the highest earners have this really drastic increase in earnings. So we are seeing this widening inequality in earnings. And we're also seeing similar patterns for being married, or the converse, which is being single. So rates of being single are highest among the lowest earners. What we don't see is much action in terms of health factors. So we have information from conscription about these men's height and BMI at conscription. And so we don't see enough of a variation in these kind of health-related factors that could explain the relationship between earnings and childlessness. And similarly for BMI, which is pretty much flat across the entire distribution of earnings. Okay. Interest of time, I'm going to skip talking about the prison sentences and data quality. And I'm going to tell you just a little bit about the causal exercise that we do. So as I said, we focus on the impact of earnings, and in order to test that more causally, we actually look at the impact of bankruptcies. So bankruptcy filings associated with a large increase in unemployment risk and a reduction in earnings. And although they might not be entirely random because they may be selection into firms that eventually go bankrupt, we try to allow for that as much as possible by including individual fixed effects, which would account for any time invariant characteristics of the individual that co-vary with them selecting into this bad firm. And then we also include a control group of siblings who are not working for a firm that eventually goes bankrupt. Okay, so we have this sort of difference in difference combination event study specification. The event is the bankruptcy, and then we include the control group of same-sex siblings. So these are essentially brothers who do not work for a firm that goes bankrupt. Okay, and then we have age fixed effects, year fixed effects, and individual fixed effects. Okay, so we look at men 25 to 35 around the time of the bankruptcy, between 95 and 2015. Okay, so this is what we find. We look at some key outcomes that correlate with what we were interested in, which is family outcomes, and then obviously labor market outcomes. So the first thing we see is that this is time zero, that the risk of being unemployed increases significantly at the time of bankruptcy, and earnings also dip significantly at the time of bankruptcy. So the bankruptcy is having the labor market outcomes that we sort of wanted to have. Then we see a significant increase in the probability of being single, a decrease in the probability of experiencing the birth of a child. And this impact is mostly focused on the birth of a first child. So this is like transitioning out of childlessness. And then there's a cumulative effect on total fertility. So overall, these men, even 5 years after bankruptcy, have fewer children. Now, we then check to see if these effects are persistent by following these men for a little bit longer. So again, let me focus you on the bottom three panels. So we have impact on births, total children, and being single. Now, what's interesting is that the probability of experiencing a birth sort of fades after around 6 years after experiencing the bankruptcy and goes back to around 0. However, the impact on total fertility never recovers. And this is because of these missed births in these 6 years after the bankruptcy that the men are not able to compensate for in later life. So there's a cumulative effect on total fertility of these men that is seen even 15 years after the event. Okay, so we're basically showing that with a sort of shock of, onto the labor market via bankruptcy, which affects earnings, we have these long-term impacts on male fertility, on them transitioning out of childlessness and total fertility. And the last thing that I would like to show you before concluding is, again, a little bit more of a descriptive exercise. So in the factual section, I showed you two things. One was that there is a correlation between male fertility and earnings. And the second one was this inequality has been growing over time. So we think that the exercise with bankruptcies shows something towards the first fact. So it's showing us in a more causal way that earnings are driving fertility, but it doesn't say much about what's happening over time and why inequality may have been growing over time. So what we do, and I'm showing you in this slide, is that we regress the probability of having a child on your employment status in the previous year, like a type of Mincer regression. So we account for your experience, your age, your schooling. And then we plot this coefficient, so this relationship between having a child and losing your job over time, so across the calendar years that we have in our data, which is these 30 years. And you can see the coefficient here and this differential, which is always negative. So if a man loses a job, he's less likely to have a child in the subsequent year. But the important thing is that this differential is getting more negative with each calendar year. So in our data, we see that over these last 30 years, the sort of penalty to having lost your job in terms of male fertility is growing. So we see like a growing penalty to job loss in terms of access to family life. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. So we document rising inequality in male fertility, and we use bankruptcies to show this in a more causal way, and then also do a sort of exercise to show growing inequality over time can be driven by this increasing fertility penalty to job loss. Okay, so thanks very much for your attention.
Great, thanks so much, Selma, really interesting. So why don't we hold questions to the end of all the talks in the interest of time and move on to the discussant. So go ahead.
Okay. Wait a minute. No way I can. Here it is. Okay, well, I'm not an expert in the topic and I'm not currently working on fertility, so my comments will be mainly questions. I found the paper really interesting, and you have, as Selma shown, great data, and being in a developing country, observing all the data you can work with is really great. So, and for me, that as I said, I don't work in the topic. It was very surprising the findings of the paper, both in terms of these huge gaps in fertility between males and the evolution in time. So, as I said, my comments are mainly questions. The main one refers to the literature review, which I found interesting, but I think that you have like different studies that assess different pieces of the puzzle, but it was not clear to me whether there are studies finding similar patterns for other countries, whether this is, as you said, you mentioned the external validity, whether this pattern has been found in other countries or is only found in Norway. Secondly, regarding the data methods, on the event study sample, I was wondering whether the fact that you have to restrict your sample to offering from parents of maybe of higher fertilities in the you can't observe, you don't include by definition households with one child households, etc. And you need households with 2 children and of the same sex. How this selection works? You do a lot of robustness checks, but yet I was wondering whether this result can be expanded for the whole sample. Secondly, regarding at the same time, maybe there is a simultaneity between fertility choices and the type of employment you accept and you find and you look for. So maybe that's a thing that it can be discussed to a larger extent. Then the pre-bankruptcy characteristics among treated and controlled siblings, there are a bit different in terms of childlessness and unemployment, if I understood correctly the table. And it was not very clear to me, how do you choose the control group? There are siblings, but you mentioned that the sampling criteria are similar to the treated group, but it was not completely clear which are those criteria, whether they have also to work in private firms, etc., and whether even there are siblings, still they can be different in unobservables, maybe in their attitudes towards risk, etc. Then regarding the income variable, at least maybe this doesn't hold at all in developed countries, but in developing countries, in many studies, it is found that men tend to have higher earnings when they have children. So I don't know if this is also found in Norway, and how this could bias, if this holds, how this might bias your results. Then if cultural patterns might have changed due to immigration and probably the composition of low salaried workers. And also, how do these patterns look if you use education as a more structural variable rather than income? And then regarding the channels, you have the graphs also for female, for women, but how this evolution you see matches with the female fertility patterns, and as a channel, what is happening in terms of whether homogamy is the same, and whether matching patterns changed, and this might be explaining some of your results. And maybe I finish here, but I found the paper very interesting, so thanks.
Thank you so much for your comments. I would love it if you could share the document with me. I only managed to make a few notes. But just to say that we don't know of much evidence that these patterns have been documented elsewhere, but mainly because it just hasn't been studied. So that's not to say that it's not the case. I think it's it's an interesting point about men with children having higher income. And I think that's the eternal question is, do men with higher income get children, or do they get a better job when their wife or partner gets pregnant? And I think the sort of goal of the bankruptcy was a little bit to try to separate that out. So the bankruptcy being the shock. I mean, it's not a perfect exercise, but we think it gives some, let's say, upper bound on what the impact might be. Yeah, thank you.
Oh, great. Thank you. Thank you for your comments, Andrea. And so last but not least, we'll move on to Margaux Suteau.
Yes. Okay. Oh, nope. Sorry. Okay, can you see my screen now? Yep, okay. So I will be presenting my work in inheritance rights and women's empowerment in the labor and marriage markets in India. So there are different forms of discrimination in India. For instance, women are mainly excluded from land rights. Between 3 to 15% of women own land themselves, which is very few compared to men. And we have seen also other trends, such as stagnating female labor force participation. And this persistent difference reinforce each other. So the lack of access to ownership leads to fewer opportunities in the labor market, and vice versa. So the aim of this paper is to use an exogenous shock on women's economic situation, which is the Hindu Succession Act amendments, to explore the effect of this increase in opportunity to become landowners on other economic outcomes. So just a few words about the amendments I'm studying. So in 1956, the government of India passed the Hindu Succession Act, which granted daughters of Hindu male the right to inherit from the separate property, which is everything that has been self-acquired by an individual during its lifetime. Indeed, in India, there are two forms of property, the separate property, but also the joint property, which is everything that has been acquired by the ancestors and passed on from generations to generation through the co-personary system. And to note that this joint property is mainly constituted of land and dwellings. Between 1976 and 1994, 5 states in India decided to amend the HSA to allow women to obtain the right to obtain the joint property as well, opening late land rights as well. In 2005, those amendments were extended to all states in India with the Hindu Succession Amendment Act. And I will use this national reform as well in the robustness checks. So here you can see in the map, the red states are the ones that amended the HSA before 2005, and you can see the dates here. So other papers in the literature have tried to analyze the effect of the amendments. My work is mainly based on 2 articles. Roy in 2015, who showed that following the amendments of the HSA, parents were not more likely to give the land to their daughters. They avoid this eventuality, but instead increased alternative form of transfers such as education or dowry. I also used the work of Is and Tan 2020, who showed that following the amendments, women increased their labor force participation and their intra-household bargaining power. So how does my paper fit in this literature? I start by looking at education, and I find the same result as in most of the literature, which is an increase by approximately a year of education following the amendments. So it's consistent with the paper of Roy and of others, and this is reassuring for my methodology and the setting. However, contradictory to the literature, I find no general effect on labor force participation. Instead, I clarified the mechanism, and I found that there is an increase in labor force participation, but only for certain women. Therefore, I look at another hypothesis that would be that parents compensate their daughters with education, not for labor market opportunities, but for marriage market opportunity. And indeed, I found that women increase their age at marriage following the amendments in landed household relative to non-landed one. Therefore, the conclusion, but we will talk about it in more details in the results section, is that parents choose to compensate their daughters with education to increase their opportunity on the marriage market, as education and dowry is becoming a very important asset on the marriage market. Before going into the details of the result, just a few words about the data and the identification strategy. So I'm using the Indian Human Development Survey, especially the 2011 and 2012 round of interview, which is the most recent survey used for this issue. This is a nationally representative survey interviewing more than 41,000 households. And I restrict this sample to women aged between 15 and 49 ever married, to Hindu, Sikh, Jain, and Buddhist women, because in India, laws do not necessarily apply to all religious groups. And it's the case of the Hindu Succession Act that only applies to those 4 religious groups. I also restrict the sample to the 16 main states of India for homogeneity concern. And at the end, I have a sample of more than 28,000 individuals. Looking at the identification strategy, I mainly based my work on Roy 2015, who used the fact that women between 0 and 10 years old at the time of the amendments were young enough for parents to make decisions according to them. Therefore, you can see here on the table, I have 3 what I call most treated cohort, what's also called in her article, which is constituted of the women born after the amendments, which I'm able to identify thanks to my most recent survey, and women between 0 to 10 years old. I also had 2 partially treated cohorts, women between 11 and 15 years old and women between 16 and 20 years old. These women were more likely to be already out of school, married, and on the labor market at the time of the amendments, but it allows to have heterogeneity effects and to look at maybe effect on the marriage market, even for those a little bit older women. In addition, I use the fact that the joint property is mainly constituted of land, as I said earlier, and I interact those treated cohort of age with a dummy equal to 1 if the woman comes from a landed household. So here is the equation. So yi is the outcome. I have in each regression a state and a year of birth fixed effect. The D post-ref, D1, D2, etc. are the cohorts of age. So dummies for women being of those age at the time of the amendments. And as I said, it's interacted with a land dummy. I also have a list of covariates controlling for household and individual characteristics. So it's a difference in different strategy and even a triple difference in different strategy. Therefore, I checked the parallel trend assumption and I found that it holds. It's been checked in many papers in the literature and hence it's not threatening the results I will show you in just a minute. So first results are the number of years of education of these women. So here in this table, you can see only the first half of the table, so the interacted terms. I removed the non-interacted terms for the sake of clarity because they are non-significant. So, but they are included, of course, in the regression. You can look at column 3 because it's where I add all controls and fixed effects. And what we can see is that for 2 of the most treated cohorts and 1 of the partially treated cohorts, we have a positive and significant effect in terms of the number of education. It's very close in magnitude and in significance to the literature, so I won't spend too much time on this, but it is again reassuring on my identification strategy and results. What's interesting though is the burn after the amendments interacted with land. This is a negative and insignificant effect. However, the non-interacted terms is positive and significant. One of the hypotheses is that following the long-term effect of the amendment spread in the population, and the acceptable level of schooling for girls increased even in households that were not directly affected by the amendments. Now, as I said earlier, one of the possibilities is that parents tended to increase their daughters' education to compensate from disinheriting them after the amendments. And one of the reasons could be to increase their opportunity on the labor market. But here again, looking at column 3, we don't have any significant effect on the number of days worked the previous year. It's contradictory with one paper on the literature, so Heath and Tan 2020, who finds a positive effect. So to try to find the reason why I have different effects, I looked at different types of job, and indeed I found an effect significant and positive for salary work. In India, women, the percentage of women working is quite low, and salary work is mainly formal, white collar, and high-paying jobs. So this is consistent with actually the result of Heath and Tan, who showed that their result is mainly driven by high-paying jobs. So my paper sheds the light on a new mechanism, which is that although the amendments did not benefited to all women in terms of labor market outcome, but some, probably women that were already more integrated in the formal labor market, benefited from it. But again, I argue that this is not most of the women, as those women working in salary work only represent 5% of the women in my sample. So we cannot say that the amendments had a huge effect in terms of labor force participation for all women in the treated group. Therefore, I look at another possibility, which is that the amendments triggered an increase in education, not for labor force participation or labor market outcome, but for marriage market outcome. Indeed, there are papers suggesting that in recent years, the marriage market returns to education on the labor market, the marriage market returns to education in India has been increasing for women. Therefore, I look at variables on the marriage market, and especially age at marriage. So again, looking at column 3, we can see here the second part of the table, so the non-interacted terms first, and we can see that here they are all negative and significant. Now looking at the first half of the table, so it's the same table, I just cut it in half because for the sake of clarity again, but it's the same table here as the first part with the interaction. We can see that the interaction is positive and significant. So what does this mean? It means that in general, the age of marriage decreased for everyone, but women from landed households were able to counter this effect. To understand what is happening here, I mostly based my work on two articles, Roy 2015 again, who showed that alongside an increase of education, parents also increased dowry for their daughters following the amendments. The seminal work of Anderson 2003 on dowry showed that dowry had two main aims, especially in India. It is both a pre-mortem bequest and a price in the marriage market. Those both use are at stake here if we want to understand the effect. My conclusion is that parents that were affected by the amendments increased dowry. They increased the pre-mortem bequest because they were not giving they were not necessarily giving them the land, but instead increased the dowry as a compensation, which increased the price on the marriage market for everyone. Therefore, parents that were probably not able to increase dowry as much, maybe, and especially non-landed household, people that were less affected by the amendments, married their daughters younger to avoid this price increase. So those results are checked on with several methods. So first of all, I use the fact that women who were married before the amendments were not affected by the amendments. So and I found the same results. I also use another wave of the Indian Human Development Survey, the 2005 round. I use the 2005 national reform, and I found the same result on education. And I used two samples of individuals that were not directly affected by the amendments, so men and non-Hindu women, to make sure that my results are not driven by something else than the amendments. And both those robustness checks allow us to conclude this. So just a small conclusion, this paper links several works on the amendments from the literature. I show that the amendments trigger the positive effect in terms of education, because education is an important asset in the labor market, but mainly on the marriage market, and it's also an alternative form of transfer. I find no effect on the labor force participation, except for women in more formal, high-paying jobs, but those women do not represent the vast majority of the employment of women in India. And finally, I found a large effect on the marriage market. Dowry increase, leading to a general decrease in the marriage market, compensated for landed households. So thank you very much for your attention. If you have any questions or comments, I'll be glad to hear it.
Great, thank you, Margaux. Very interesting. Okay, so now we have our discussant. Yeah, Selma.
Can you see my slides? Yeah, great. So thanks, Margaux, for an excellent presentation and for this very interesting paper, which I really enjoyed reading. Let me just summarize briefly what the paper is about, and then I'll give you some comments. So the question studied in this paper is, what is the impact of women's land rights on their economic outcomes? And the method used to answer this question is an exogenous change in inheriting rights of women in India. Specifically, there was a series of amendments to an older law, and these were implemented from 1979 to 1994 in 5 states. I know that you dropped one of the states because you didn't feel that it was sort of clean enough. And what these amendments did was, previously women could only inherit land if their father died with no will, but now women had the right to inherit their share of joint property from their father, regardless of whether or not there was a will. And then this actually became a nationwide reform in 2005 for all the remaining states. Now, the treated group are girls 10 and under at the time of amendment, and then you have some partially treated girls, and then the control group are women aged 21 and above. And then you add to that a triple difference, which is taking into account whether the household is landed. So you have this hypothesis that this would only impact basically households that actually own any land. And what you find is the significant increase in the education of girls born after the reform, no impact on their labour force participation, and some mixed findings for age at marriage, where sort of counterintuitively it seems that age at marriage actually decreased after this reform. So I have a couple of comments on interpretation, which are probably the more important ones, and then a few on the method. So one of the things that jumped out to me was that I didn't see any evidence on impacts on actual land inheritance. And I know that you refer to the other paper by Roy, which suggests that parents actually acted strategically to avoid giving their daughters land inheritance. But this is somewhat, for me, a little bit concerning, and I have to ask whether the reform then actually has bite. Because if it's a binding reform, then you would expect to see impacts on land inheritance. And if it's not a binding reform, then why do we see any impacts at all on anything? Never mind land, but also these other outcomes. So I'd like to know a little bit more about what the mechanism is that you have in mind. How would these land bequests be avoided if the law stipulates that daughters do have land rights? Okay. My next comment on interpretation is, obviously, given I work on fertility, this is probably a natural one for me, but an alternative explanation for why you may have seen these impacts on education is that it may be the case that parents substituted out of the quantity of children that they're having and into the quality of those children. So from our very classical quantity-quality model of fertility. And the idea being simply they know that their daughters are now going to be inheriting their land, and they would like this land essentially to go to higher quality, more educated daughters who would be more able to look after this land. So can you check whether there was any fertility impacts of these reforms? The findings on age at marriage are surprising. So landed women marry relatively later, but overall everyone marries earlier. And I know you suggest an explanation based on an increase in dowry. But what's super interesting for me actually to have received this paper to discuss is that I'm working on the impact of a different amendment in India, and that's the 84-85 amendment, which placed a cap on the amount of dowry that could be given at the time of marriage. And actually what we find is that the result of this amendment was strong impacts on fertility and education. So then I'm wondering what else is changing during this time that may sort of affect your findings on age at marriage. So could you conduct a placebo using some alternative amendment years just to double check that you are specifically capturing the amendment you have in mind? And specifically the reform in one of the states you use, Andhra Pradesh in 86, to me seems a little bit too close to the 84-85 amendments to the amount of dowry that could be given. So you might think about doing a robustness check, removing Andhra Pradesh. Okay, and then a few final comments on just more minor comments, I guess, on methods. So the reforms took place over a long period of time. They're quite spaced out. So I wonder whether they were truly a surprise, or were they in response to changes already taking place in these states? And I would have liked to see in your paper some summary statistics prior to the reform, so comparing the amended and unamended states on some basic characteristics like income, female labor force participation, just to see whether they're sort of comparable even prior to the reform. And your definition of a landed household stems from the status of the married household, so the husband's household for those who are married, and you might think about removing those in an additional robustness check. And then finally, you discussed this in your talk, but the post-reform variable is statistically significant on its own for education. And I wonder whether this indicates any underlying differences in trends in education between treated and untreated states. Have you thought about including some state linear trends to try to account for that? And finally, cutting the treatment group at age 10 could be a little bit arbitrary. So you could think about shifting that by ±1 year and seeing if your results hold. Okay, thanks. So I'll stop there, and thanks for an excellent paper.
Thank you very much. Can I answer now, or?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So if you can send me by emails all the comments. Same, I didn't have time to write it all, but it's all interesting comments. So I'd love to have it all, having them all to think about it. So there are many very good ideas of the placebo. I know that the dowry cap, the law on dowry, is something I've been thinking about. I was also thinking of doing something like a triple strategy, different strategy about it. So I'm thinking about it, but what you also suggested was very interesting, and I know that I need to think about it more. Just about your first comment on isn't binding reform. So actually what the paper of Roy suggests is that there is a very high share of women gifting their property to their brothers following the amendments. So the thing is, it's binding, but it's there were ways to avoid giving it to the daughters. So there were strategies, legal strategy to make sure that the brothers would get it, and it was not always enforced, from what I understood from some reports. So both effects are at stake. About the fertility, it's also something I tried to look at, but I didn't find any particular findings, although I know that now I've seen a paper on fertility about studying the amendments. So that's something I should also check again. And it's an important concern. Yes, and then after that, all the comments were very interesting, but I didn't note everything. But I definitely think about some of what you said, such as trying to remove Andhra Pradesh to make sure that it's not affected by the dowry law, and I always kept the 10-year-old to reproduce Roy work. But I think you're right. I think it's maybe too arbitrary, and I can have some checks around that. So yeah, again, thank you very much. And if you can send me your comments, that would be very nice.
Great, thanks for your responses.
Right. Well, thank you to all the presenters and discussants. This was a really interesting session. I think we have time now to sort of open it up to just an open discussion. If anyone has other follow-up questions for the presenters or anything that we want to discuss relating these to these topics. No?
I have a short question to Selma. Well, I enjoy all the papers, so thank you, all the presenters and the comments. Selma, I have a question related to your main results, how you present them. So I noticed that your baseline is -5, that is 5 years before bankruptcy. I mean, it's not a big deal, but maybe it's not the standard. Or I was expecting that you said the baseline the moment treatment starts, right? Or the moment could you explain why you decide to present that way? So we need to interpret that in terms of the moment before the event, or not just the bankruptcy episode and the person or the man losing the job. That's it. Thank you.
I'm impressed by your attention to detail. It's interesting because this comment has come up recently by a couple of referees. So I think you're absolutely right. And the reason we do it, so
wasn't me.
Yeah, well, who knows? So I didn't mention in the talk, I did not mention in the talk that we, the way we select people who are working in a firm that goes bankrupt is we check 2 years before the bankruptcy. So at T-2, we select, are you working at the firm that will eventually go bankrupt or not? And then we follow these people subsequently and see what happens at time 0. And there's a trade-off basically, because if we wait until the year of the bankruptcy, we end up with a very select sample of only sort of the worst that are still left at this firm. And if we would select at T-5, we would have people who probably are not even working there 5 years later. So we would have quite a messy treatment group. So we chose T-2. And then the question is, what is the reference point? And the reason we chose T-5 was we wanted to get so as far away as possible from the sort of creeping pre-trends that start just a couple of years before the bankruptcy. So you might have noticed in the graphs already at T-2, we see a slight decline in earnings and increase in unemployment because essentially we have these firms which are rapidly deteriorating over time, and as a result wages are dropping in these firms. So that's why we chose T-5. We wanted to have a reference point that was kind of your pre-outcomes that are not messed up by this firm, you know, who's about to go bust. But honestly, I think we might have to reformulate it because I don't know. I'm curious if you think that's a good reason.
I think it's okay. It's just you need to explain it. I mean, I'm not the referee, so I don't know if it
Well,
counts or not what I think.
Opinion.
But fair enough. I think I'm happy with your answer. I mean, it's just the standard, the way we are used to see the plots. But if you have a good reason, and I think you do, that's okay. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks for your question.
Anyone else? Any questions for any of the speakers? No, I mean, of course, you can always email any follow-ups. So yeah, wonderful. This was a really, really interesting session, really great papers from all over the world. We saw a lot of interesting new findings. So thank you so much, everyone, for coming to this session, and really nice to meet everyone, and thanks for the presenters again. And yeah, I guess we will end a little bit early so everyone has a little bit of a break before the next session. Great. All right.
Thank you very much.
So much. Yeah,
Thank you so much.
bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.